It began with a routine review inside a restricted palace records office, an administrative check that should have lasted less than an hour. But when Princess Anne was handed a security report containing one unexpected name, everything changed. A visitor had allegedly entered a section of the royal archives that few people even knew existed. And according to growing whispers, that visitor was connected to Queen Camilla's family. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. At first, the report appeared insignificant. Palace staff process countless documents every week, and most are forgotten almost as quickly as they arrive. But this one was different. Hidden among routine entries and security confirmations was a detail that immediately caught the attention of senior officials. According to sources familiar with the matter, Princess Anne paused when she noticed a name that seemed completely out of place. It was not the name of a senior royal. It was not a trusted archivist. It was not someone known to possess clearance for highly protected historical records. Yet there it was, sitting quietly on an access log that should have raised no alarms at all. The discovery reportedly triggered an immediate chain of questions. Who authorized the visit? Why had the name appeared on a restricted list? And perhaps most importantly, what exactly had been accessed during that visit? The royal archives are not ordinary storage rooms filled with forgotten paperwork. They are considered one of the monarchy's most protected resources, containing records, correspondence, and historical materials tied to generations of royal history. Access is tightly controlled, and even within palace circles, only a limited number of individuals are permitted to enter certain sections. As concerns spread through administrative offices, whispers began circulating among aides and advisors. Some reportedly believed there had been a simple misunderstanding. Others feared something much larger was unfolding behind the scenes. The fact that the visitor was allegedly connected to Queen Camilla's inner family circle only intensified the speculation. Suddenly, what should have been a routine review was becoming the subject of private discussions in corridors, offices, and meeting rooms throughout the palace. Princess Anne, known for her unwavering commitment to protocol and duty, was said to be particularly troubled by the discovery. Throughout her life, she had earned a reputation as one of the monarchy's most disciplined protectors. Rules existed for a reason. Procedures existed for a reason. And when questions emerged about whether those procedures had been bypassed, Anne reportedly wanted answers immediately. Not assumptions. Not explanations. Answers. Meanwhile, palace officials quietly began examining archive security procedures. Access records were reportedly reviewed. Visitor authorizations were scrutinized. Internal discussions became increasingly urgent as concerns grew over what sensitive materials might have been viewed. With every new review came another unanswered question, and with every unanswered question came even greater uncertainty. Rumors soon began spreading beyond palace walls, with insiders suggesting that documents of significant historical importance may have been involved. No one seemed willing to speak publicly. No official statements emerged. Yet the silence itself became part of the story. The more carefully people avoided the subject, the more attention it attracted. Something had happened. Everyone seemed to agree on that much. What remained unclear was how deep the issue truly went, and whether this unusual archive visit was merely the beginning of a much larger royal controversy. But the mystery surrounding that access request would soon reveal something far more troubling than a simple administrative mistake. For generations, certain sections of the royal archives have remained beyond the reach of ordinary staff, visitors, and even many members of the royal household. Hidden behind layers of protocol and security, these records contain some of the monarchy's most sensitive historical documents. So why would anyone outside that trusted circle suddenly appear on an access list? That question lingered heavily over the palace in the days following Princess Anne's discovery. What had initially seemed like an isolated irregularity was beginning to expose a world that most people never even knew existed. The royal archives were not simply collections of old papers gathering dust in forgotten rooms. They represented the living memory of the monarchy itself. Every letter, every decree, every confidential communication preserved within those protected records formed part of a centuries-long story of power, duty, triumph, and sacrifice. According to palace insiders, the section connected to the growing controversy was among the most restricted areas under royal protection. Access was not granted casually. Even senior staff members could spend years working within royal residences without ever receiving permission to view certain materials. Authorization required multiple levels of approval, extensive documentation, and strict oversight. The rules had been built over generations, shaped by past scandals, historical disputes, and lessons learned through some of the monarchy's most turbulent chapters. That was precisely why concern continued to grow. If the reports were accurate, someone had managed to enter an area protected by some of the strongest security procedures within the royal institution. The possibility alone was enough to unsettle experienced administrators. It was not merely a question of whether rules had been broken. It was a question of whether safeguards that had stood for decades had somehow failed. As reviews continued, palace officials reportedly began examining every stage of the authorization process. Security clearances were checked. Visitor approvals were revisited. Administrative records were compared against archive logs. Yet the deeper they looked, the more complicated the situation appeared to become. Every answer seemed to create two new questions. Every explanation left important details unresolved. Behind closed doors, discussions reportedly became increasingly intense. Some officials believed there had to be a straightforward explanation buried somewhere within the paperwork. Others feared the situation pointed to a much larger vulnerability. The idea that someone connected to the royal family's extended circle could gain access to highly sensitive historical records was difficult to ignore. It raised uncomfortable possibilities that few wanted to discuss openly. At the same time, whispers continued spreading through royal circles. Some speculated that the visitor had been granted access through an overlooked administrative pathway. Others quietly questioned whether personal influence had played a role. No evidence publicly supported any particular theory, but the absence of clear answers only fueled further speculation. The silence surrounding the matter was becoming almost as significant as the access itself. Princess Anne reportedly remained focused on one issue above all others: accountability. Rules were only meaningful if they were enforced. Protocol only mattered if it applied equally to everyone. As more information surfaced, her determination to uncover exactly what had happened appeared to strengthen. What began as a routine review was now evolving into something far more serious, a test of the palace's ability to protect its own history. And somewhere within the growing maze of reports, approvals, and unanswered questions, one detail refused to disappear. Again and again, conversations seemed to circle back to the same individual, the same connection, the same name. What had once been a quiet entry on a visitor's log was rapidly becoming the center of an increasingly explosive royal mystery. As officials searched for answers, attention slowly shifted toward the person whose name kept appearing in every conversation. At first, many believed the situation would quietly disappear. But when senior aides reportedly connected the access records to Camilla's son, the atmosphere inside palace offices changed instantly. What had started as a procedural review was rapidly becoming a full-scale controversy. The moment that connection surfaced, everything seemed to shift. For days, officials had focused on security procedures, authorization pathways, and archive protocols. Now the conversation was moving in an entirely different direction. Suddenly, the discussion was no longer centered on a mysterious visitor log. It was centered on a person, a name, a connection to one of the most closely watched figures within the royal family. According to palace whispers, the revelation triggered immediate concern among senior aides who understood the delicate position such a discovery could create. What made the situation especially sensitive was not simply the family connection itself. Royal households have always been surrounded by relatives, advisors, and trusted associates. The problem was timing. The archive review had already exposed unanswered questions. Security officials were still examining access records. Administrative teams were still searching for explanations. Yet before those answers could be found, the focus had shifted toward someone linked to Queen Camilla's inner circle. That development transformed a private administrative concern into something far more politically dangerous. As reports circulated among palace departments, conflicting explanations reportedly began emerging almost immediately. Some sources suggested the visit had been properly arranged through established channels. Others quietly questioned whether standard procedures had actually been followed. Several versions of the story appeared to exist at once, each offering a different explanation for how entry had been granted. The more people talked, the less clear the situation seemed to become. That uncertainty created tension throughout the palace. Officials who normally worked together found themselves examining the same records from different perspectives. Some believed the issue was being exaggerated. Others argued that the very existence of unanswered questions justified deeper scrutiny. What united everyone, however, was a growing desire to identify one crucial detail: who had authorized the access in the first place? That question lingered over every discussion. Authorizations do not appear from nowhere. Visitor approvals do not simply materialize. Somewhere within the chain of procedures, someone had signed off on the request. Someone had opened a door that otherwise would have remained closed. And until that person was identified, speculation continued to spread. Outside palace walls, whispers reportedly began reaching media circles as well. Royal correspondents and insiders started hearing fragments of the story. Nothing concrete, nothing confirmed, but enough to spark curiosity. Questions about restricted archives, confidential records, and family connections created the kind of mystery that naturally attracted attention. The silence from official channels only intensified public interest. Meanwhile, Princess Anne reportedly remained focused on facts rather than rumors. While speculation expanded in every direction, she was said to be concentrating on the evidence already in front of her. Logs, approvals, security records, procedures. Yet even as officials searched for clarity, an uncomfortable realization was beginning to emerge. This controversy might not be about unauthorized access alone. The deeper investigators looked, the more they began wondering whether the true story lay elsewhere entirely. Because hidden beneath the debate over permissions and procedures was another question, one that few had considered at the beginning. If access had been granted, what exactly was so important inside those protected archives that someone would want to see it? Why risk attracting attention? Why enter one of the palace's most restricted areas at all? As that possibility took hold, the investigation entered an even more unsettling phase. The identity of the visitor remained significant, but it was no longer the only mystery demanding answers. Increasingly, insiders found themselves drawn toward a far more explosive theory, one that threatened to reshape the entire narrative and turn a troubling controversy into something far bigger than anyone had first imagined. Yet, the biggest shock was not who entered the archives, it was what some insiders believed they were trying to find. Few figures within the monarchy command respect quite like Princess Anne. Known for her discipline and unwavering commitment to royal duty, she rarely intervenes publicly. But according to palace whispers, this situation crossed a line she could not ignore. As questions surrounding the archive access continued to multiply, many inside the palace reportedly began looking toward one person for leadership. Throughout decades of royal service, Princess Anne had built a reputation not through grand speeches or public campaigns, but through consistency, discipline, and an uncompromising dedication to duty. She was often described as someone who viewed royal responsibilities not as privileges, but as obligations. That reputation now placed her at the center of a controversy that seemed to be growing more serious with every passing day. According to insiders, Anne was no longer satisfied with preliminary explanations. The uncertainty surrounding the archive entry had reached a point where simple reassurances were no longer enough. Reports suggest she requested a far more detailed review, one designed to examine every stage of the process from beginning to end. What had once been treated as a narrow administrative concern was now being approached as a matter involving the integrity of palace procedures themselves. As a result, security logs reportedly underwent renewed examination. Records that had already been reviewed were checked again. Timelines were reconstructed. Visitor authorizations were compared against archive entries. Officials allegedly began looking for inconsistencies that might have been overlooked during earlier assessments. Nothing was considered too minor to investigate. Every signature, every approval, and every procedural step suddenly carried new importance. That renewed scrutiny created an atmosphere of growing pressure throughout palace departments. Staff members who previously believed the issue would fade away found themselves facing increasingly difficult questions. Some were reportedly asked to clarify procedures they had followed months earlier. Others were required to explain how certain approvals had been processed. The deeper the review progressed, the more apparent it became that this was no longer about one individual visit. It was becoming an examination of the entire system responsible for protecting some of the monarchy's most sensitive records. At the same time, discussions reportedly turned toward historical protocols that had governed archive access for generations. Long-standing rules were revisited. Safeguards established decades earlier were re-examined. Officials sought to understand not only whether procedures had been followed, but whether those procedures remained strong enough to prevent future controversies. What began as a search for accountability was evolving into a broader effort to reinforce institutional trust. Significantly, Anne was not alone in her concerns. According to Palace Whispers, a growing number of senior officials supported stronger oversight measures. Some believed the controversy had exposed weaknesses that needed immediate attention. Others argued that public confidence in royal institutions depended on demonstrating that rules applied equally to everyone, regardless of status or connections. Gradually, support began forming around the idea that decisive action would be necessary. As the review expanded, the controversy reportedly climbed higher through the palace hierarchy. Information was shared with increasingly senior figures. Discussions moved beyond administrative offices and into circles where matters affecting the monarchy's reputation were taken extremely seriously. What had started with a single name on a visitor log was now attracting attention at the highest levels of royal administration. Yet even as officials worked to uncover the truth, a growing sense of urgency began spreading through the institution. The stakes were no longer limited to archive access. They now involved trust, accountability, and the preservation of traditions that had survived for generations. Princess Anne's determination had transformed the investigation from a routine inquiry into something far larger, and once that transformation occurred, events began moving with remarkable speed. What followed was a response so swift that even longtime palace observers were caught off guard. Within days, reports suggested that access privileges were being reviewed across multiple departments. Doors that had remained open for years suddenly required additional approvals, and long-standing procedures were placed under scrutiny. The response was swift, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. What had begun as a troubling question buried inside an archive report was now reshaping the way sensitive areas of the palace operated. According to insiders, an emergency review of archive access was launched with a level of urgency rarely seen in routine administrative matters. Officials who once viewed the controversy as a temporary distraction were now confronting the reality that it had evolved into one of the most closely watched internal reviews in recent memory. As investigators continued examining records, new restrictions were reportedly introduced across several departments. Access permissions that had previously required only basic approval suddenly faced additional layers of verification. Procedures that had remained unchanged for years were reopened for examination. Every safeguard was questioned. Every assumption was challenged. The message appearing to emerge from senior leadership was simple. If vulnerabilities existed, they would no longer be ignored. That shift created a noticeable change throughout palace operations. Employees accustomed to familiar procedures reportedly found themselves adapting to stricter requirements. Requests that once moved quickly through administrative channels now faced greater scrutiny. Authorizations required additional confirmation. Security reviews became more detailed. While many understood the reasons behind the changes, others quietly worried about what those changes revealed. Institutions only tighten controls when they believe something important may have gone wrong. Meanwhile, senior staff members reportedly took direct responsibility for overseeing compliance checks. Rather than delegating the process entirely to lower departments, experienced officials became increasingly involved in monitoring reviews and evaluating recommendations. Their participation signaled the seriousness of the situation. This was no longer a routine procedural update. It was a coordinated effort to restore confidence in systems that had suddenly come under intense pressure. Yet even as safeguards were strengthened, deeper concerns continued to surface. Some officials reportedly feared the controversy had exposed weaknesses that extended beyond a single archive visit. If one unexpected entry could trigger such widespread alarm, what other vulnerabilities might still exist unnoticed? That question began echoing through discussions at multiple levels of the institution. The focus was no longer limited to understanding what had happened. It was expanding toward preventing anything similar from happening again. At the center of those concerns was trust. For generations, the monarchy had relied upon carefully maintained procedures to protect its records, traditions, and institutional memory. Those systems were designed to ensure continuity through changing eras, changing governments, and changing royal households. The possibility that confidence in those systems had been shaken created anxiety far beyond the immediate controversy itself. As public curiosity continued growing, palace officials reportedly worked carefully to contain the situation. Information remained tightly controlled. Discussions stayed behind closed doors. Public statements remained limited. Yet the effort to prevent further escalation proved increasingly difficult. The more attention focused on archive security, the more people wanted answers. And the more questions remained unanswered, the larger the controversy seemed to become. Princess Anne's determination had undoubtedly accelerated the review, but it had also brought uncomfortable realities into the open. The institution was now confronting questions it could no longer avoid. Questions about oversight, questions about accountability, questions about how access had been granted in the first place. And while tightened security measures provided one response, they did not address the mystery that still lingered beneath the surface. Because the controversy was no longer being driven solely by concerns about procedures or permissions. A new possibility was beginning to emerge, one that some insiders reportedly found even more unsettling. Attention was shifting away from how the archives had been accessed and toward a far more explosive question: why? But tightening security was only part of the story, because attention was now turning toward the deeper implications of what had happened. The more officials examined the situation, the more questions emerged. Was this simply an innocent misunderstanding, or had the incident exposed weaknesses that had existed for years without anyone noticing? That question refused to go away. In fact, with every review, every meeting, and every new piece of information, it seemed to grow larger. What had once appeared to be a straightforward investigation was now unfolding into something far more complicated. Palace insiders reportedly found themselves divided, not over the facts that had already been uncovered, but over what those facts actually meant. Was this the result of a harmless procedural oversight, or had the controversy exposed cracks within the system that had remained hidden for years? The debate quickly became one of intent versus oversight. Some officials reportedly believed that the focus should remain on administrative procedures. In their view, mistakes can happen even within the most carefully managed institutions. A misplaced approval, an overlooked detail, or a misunderstood authorization could explain much of what had occurred. But others were far less convinced. They argued that the deeper issue was not a single decision, but the possibility that important safeguards had become vulnerable over time. That concern struck at the heart of the palace itself. The royal archives were never intended to function as ordinary storage facilities. They existed to protect the monarchy's institutional memory, preserving records connected to generations of royal history. Every document represented a piece of a larger story. Every record carried historical significance. The thought that access controls surrounding those materials might have been compromised created unease among those responsible for safeguarding them. As discussions intensified, attention increasingly shifted toward archive protection as a whole. Officials reportedly began asking broader questions about security measures, oversight procedures, and accountability systems. If this controversy had revealed a weakness, how many others might still exist undiscovered? It was a difficult question because it forced the institution to examine itself rather than focusing solely on a single incident. Meanwhile, historical records that had remained hidden from public attention for decades suddenly became the center of growing fascination. Curiosity spread beyond palace walls. Royal observers, commentators, and members of the public all found themselves drawn into the mystery. The archives carried an almost legendary reputation, and the idea that someone connected to a prominent royal figure had allegedly accessed a restricted section only deepened public interest. Every unanswered question seemed to create three more. Inside the palace, however, the controversy was becoming increasingly personal. Some insiders reportedly feared that public discussion was drifting away from facts and toward assumptions. Others believed the situation demanded even greater transparency. Those differing perspectives created tension throughout various departments. What united everyone was the realization that the issue could no longer be treated as an isolated event involving one visitor. That realization marked a turning point. The controversy was expanding beyond a single individual and becoming something much larger. Questions about access had evolved into questions about trust. Questions about trust had evolved into questions about oversight. And questions about oversight were beginning to challenge assumptions that had long gone unexamined. The deeper officials looked, the more they seemed to uncover layers of uncertainty that nobody had anticipated when the investigation first began. Yet perhaps the most unsettling development was the growing sense that the story was still incomplete. Despite weeks of reviews and countless discussions, important pieces of the puzzle remained missing. The institution could strengthen procedures. It could tighten security. It could examine records and revisit protocols. But none of those actions could answer the question that continued haunting every conversation. What had this incident truly revealed about the system itself? And as speculation intensified, the monarchy found itself facing a challenge it could no longer ignore. The royal family has weathered countless storms, but controversies involving trust and access strike at the very heart of the institution. Suddenly, what began as a quiet archive inquiry was becoming a broader conversation about responsibility, accountability, and royal boundaries. By this stage, the controversy had moved far beyond palace corridors and private meetings. What had once been discussed only among administrators and senior officials was now attracting growing attention from royal observers and the wider public. The reason was simple. People were no longer focused solely on a disputed archive entry. They were focused on what that entry appeared to represent. At its core, the story had become a question of trust, and trust has always been one of the most valuable and fragile assets within any monarchy. Public reaction began building steadily. Every new rumor fueled fresh curiosity. Every unanswered question generated another wave of speculation. The absence of definitive explanations created a vacuum that was quickly filled by theories, assumptions, and endless debate. Some believed the palace was dealing with a minor procedural issue that had been blown out of proportion. Others suspected that the controversy had exposed deeper institutional vulnerabilities. Regardless of which perspective people held, interest in the story continued to grow. As attention intensified, the palace itself reportedly came under increasing scrutiny. Institutions built on tradition often rely on public confidence as much as formal authority. For generations, the monarchy had projected stability, continuity, and discipline. The archive controversy challenged that image in subtle but significant ways. Questions were no longer limited to one visitor or one approval process. They were now directed toward the systems designed to protect the institution itself. According to Palace Whispers, senior royals closely monitored developments as the situation unfolded. While public silence remained largely intact, reports suggested that growing concern existed behind closed doors. The issue had become too prominent to dismiss and too sensitive to handle casually. Every decision carried consequences. Every response risked creating additional questions. It was a delicate balance that required careful judgment at every step. At the same time, discussions about transparencies reportedly gained momentum. Some believed greater openness could help restore confidence and reduce speculation. Others argued that excessive disclosure might undermine the very purpose of restricted archives and confidential procedures. The debate reflected a larger challenge facing modern institutions: how to maintain necessary privacy while satisfying public demands for accountability. Those conversations naturally led to another pressing issue: future safeguards. Even if the immediate controversy could eventually be resolved, many believed lessons would need to be learned. Officials reportedly examined ways to strengthen oversight, improve review processes, and ensure that similar concerns could be addressed more effectively in the future. The focus was shifting from reaction to prevention. Yet despite these efforts, pressure for definitive answers continued growing. Questions remained unresolved. Important details remained unclear, and with every passing day, the controversy seemed to take on a life of its own. What had started as a simple inquiry into archive access had evolved into a larger debate about responsibility, privilege, and the boundaries that protect royal institutions from controversy. Perhaps most significantly, the story was no longer being driven solely by facts already known. It was being driven by what people feared might still be hidden. That uncertainty kept the mystery alive. It kept public attention fixed on the issue, and it ensured that no amount of procedural reform could fully end the discussion until the remaining questions were addressed. But before the palace could close the chapter, one final revelation threatened to change the entire narrative. In the end, the controversy was never just about one visitor, one document, or one restricted room. It became a test of how far the monarchy would go to protect its history, its traditions, and the boundaries that define royal authority. As the final pieces of the story came together, a larger truth began to emerge. The archive controversy had started with a single access record and a single unanswered question, but it ultimately revealed something much deeper about the institution itself. For weeks, attention had focused on names, approvals, security logs, and conflicting explanations. Yet beneath all of those details was a struggle that touched the very foundation of royal governance: the responsibility to protect history while maintaining public trust. Throughout the controversy, one figure remained at the center of the response. According to Palace Whispers, Princess Anne's determination never wavered. While others debated theories and speculation, she reportedly remained focused on protocol, accountability, and safeguarding the institution she had spent her life serving. To some observers, her role became symbolic of a larger principle. Rules mattered, procedures mattered, and when questions arose regarding either, they deserved serious attention regardless of who was involved. The palace's response reflected that philosophy. Security reviews led to stronger oversight measures. Archive access procedures were reportedly reinforced. Layers of authorization received renewed scrutiny. Safeguards that had once been accepted without question were re-examined and strengthened. The controversy may have created uncertainty, but it also prompted action. In many ways, the institution emerged more aware of its vulnerabilities and more committed to protecting against them. Yet perhaps the most lasting impact came from the lessons learned. The investigation demonstrated how quickly assumptions can be challenged when trust is tested. It revealed that even long-standing systems require constant vigilance. Most importantly, it reminded those responsible for preserving royal history that traditions survive not because they are old, but because they are actively protected by each generation that inherits them. That renewed focus on tradition became one of the defining outcomes of the controversy. Historical records were no longer viewed simply as documents stored behind secure doors. They were recognized as part of a living legacy connecting the monarchy's past, present, and future. The archives represented more than information. They represented continuity. They represented identity. And protecting them meant protecting a piece of the institution itself. Even so, not every question received a definitive answer. Some uncertainties remained. Some details continued to be debated behind closed doors. And some aspects of the story may never be fully understood by the public. That reality is often unavoidable within institutions built upon centuries of tradition, confidentiality, and carefully guarded history. Certain mysteries fade with time. Others linger for generations. What is clear, however, is that the monarchy moved forward under tighter safeguards and greater awareness. Procedures evolved. Oversight strengthened. Lessons were absorbed. The controversy that once threatened to undermine confidence ultimately became an opportunity to reinforce the very structures designed to protect the institution. And perhaps that is why this story continues to resonate. It was never simply about one individual or one disputed visit. It was about the balance between access and responsibility, privilege and accountability, history and protection. It was a reminder that even within one of the world's oldest institutions, trust must be earned and safeguarded every single day. Because in the world of royalty, secrets may remain hidden for years, but once a forbidden door is opened, the consonants can echo through the palace forever. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.